Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're not rushing through history, we're drifting through it. We'll walk into ancient Rome before sunrise, where bakers quietly shaped bread while the city still slept. We'll step into medieval halls where queens faced death, not with fear, but with ritual, control, and dignity. We'll explore the invisible rules and taboos ancient people used to calm their minds when the world felt uncertain. And finally, we'll cross the desert into Palmyra, where Queen Zenobia stood before the crushing power of Rome, not in defiance, but in unshakable composure. These are not stories of violence or spectacle. They are stories of calm strength, quiet work, and inner control. How people in the past learned to live, endure, and rest. So, before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow the noise of the present to fade. Tonight, history isn't here to wake you up, it's here to let you rest.
So, people often imagine ancient Rome as a city that never rested, a place of clashing steel, shouting commanders, and endless ambition. But tonight, let that image soften and drift away, because there was another Rome, a quieter one, hidden in the early hours before sunrise, when daily life in ancient Rome moved not with violence, but with patience, warmth, and repetition. Imagine yourself there now, not as a weary soldier or a stressed politician, but as a pister, a Roman baker, someone whose work began while the rest of the city slept beneath a pale, cold mist. At 3 a.m, when streets were empty and lanterns flickered faintly, your bakery was already alive, its oven glowing softly like a steady heartbeat. This was not a job defined by pressure or fear, but by rhythm, one of the most grounding Roman jobs a person could have. You mixed flour and water in silence, feeling the texture change beneath your hands, shaping dough slowly as the fire crackled nearby, a sound that soothed rather than startled. There were no orders being barked, no deadlines shouted across marble halls, only the gentle certainty that bread would rise, that warmth would spread, and that the city would soon awaken to something comforting and familiar. In this ancient Rome peaceful life, your labor carried meaning without spectacle. Slaves, shopkeepers, and senators alike depended on your hands, not for glory, but for nourishment, for the quiet reassurance that life would continue as it always had. As dawn approached, the scent of fresh bread drifted through narrow streets, and with it came a kind of influence far more lasting than power, because everyone remembered the one who fed them when the day began. And yet, even as you imagine this gentle trade, let your mind wander a little further, because Rome offered more than one refuge from noise. Perhaps instead of flour dusting your arms, you find yourself surrounded by stone and color, working as a mosaicist, a craftsperson whose days unfolded in near silence. In a small workshop filled with filtered light, you sat for hours placing tiny pieces of stone, tesserae, one by one, each movement deliberate, unhurried, and precise. This was daily life in ancient Rome at its most meditative, where time stretched rather than chased you. A single floor or wall could take months, even years to complete, and no one expected speed, only care. The soft click of stone meeting stone replaced conversation, and in that quiet, your thoughts slowed, your breath deepened, and your sense of self became steady. While Rome outside roared with crowds and ambition, your workspace remained an island of focus, one of the few Roman jobs where silence itself was a companion. These were not the roles sung about in triumphs or carved into monuments, but they were the jobs people truly wanted, lives shaped by repetition, craft, and calm.
In a world we often imagine as harsh and relentless, these peaceful paths remind us that ancient Rome's peaceful life was not a fantasy, but a daily reality for those who found dignity in simple work. And as you listen now, letting these images settle, remember that history is not only made by those who shouted the loudest, but also by those who rose quietly before dawn, lit a fire, placed a single stone, and allowed the world to move at a human pace.
As the city of Rome slowly wakes, there is another kind of work unfolding quietly behind shaded doorways and cool stone walls. Work that never demanded speed or noise, only patience and steady hands. Imagine now that you are no longer surrounded by fire or stone, but by scrolls, wax tablets, and the soft scratch of a stylus, living the daily life in ancient Rome as a librarius, a professional scribe. While others hurried through crowded streets, your world remained contained and calm, a place where thoughts moved more slowly than footsteps. Roman jobs like this were not measured by how loudly they were seen, but by how reliably they endured. You spent hours copying texts, legal records, letters, and poetry, each line forming carefully beneath your hand. The rhythm was gentle, almost hypnotic, allowing your mind to settle into focus. There was no rush because accuracy mattered more than speed, and in this quiet balance, your work became a form of mental rest. In an age before printing, your role carried quiet importance, preserving knowledge without ever standing in the spotlight. This was ancient Rome, peaceful life expressed through discipline rather than ambition, where the reward was not praise, but trust. People returned to you again and again because your hand was steady, your mind calm, and your presence dependable. And as hours passed, the outside world faded into distant echoes, leaving only the sound of writing and the sense that time itself had slowed. But Rome's gentler professions did not end with words alone. Perhaps instead you step into the shaded gardens of a domus, tending plants as a hortulanus, a gardener whose days were shaped by sunlight, soil, and repetition. In these enclosed spaces, far from the noise of the forum, you moved at nature's pace, trimming leaves, watering roots, and watching growth unfold gradually. This was daily life in ancient Rome, aligned with the seasons, not with pressure. Roman jobs like gardening offered something rare, predictability without monotony. Each morning followed a familiar pattern, yet no 2 days were identical, because plants responded slowly and honestly, unaffected by politics or status. In tending them, your thoughts softened, your body found rhythm, and your labor became restorative rather than exhausting. While the city debated laws and chased power, you worked with things that grew quietly, reminding you that stability often comes from patience rather than control. This ancient Rome peaceful life was not about escaping responsibility, but about choosing work that respected human limits. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across marble paths, your hands were tired, but your mind remained clear. You carried with you the satisfaction of having contributed without conflict, of having shaped something lasting without force. These were the kinds of Roman jobs people rarely wrote about, yet they formed the foundation of a city that lasted centuries. And as you listen now, allow these images to blend together. The scribe's careful lines, the gardener's steady care, each offering a vision of Rome that feels unexpectedly gentle. History, when viewed through the lens of daily life in ancient Rome, reveals not only empires and battles, but also lives built around quiet purpose, where peace was not a luxury, but a daily practice. There was also a Rome that lived not by command or competition, but by care, presence, and familiarity. A Rome where some of the most wanted Roman jobs were built around trust rather than authority. Imagine yourself now as a tonsure, a barber, one of those quiet figures whose shop became a pause in the relentless motion of daily life in ancient Rome. Your workspace was small, open to the street, filled with morning light and the soft murmur of passing footsteps. People came not only to be shaved or trimmed, but to sit, to breathe, and to be still for a moment. Your hands moved gently, practiced and unhurried, and the steel blade never rushed because safety mattered more than speed. In a world where status separated many lives, your chair welcomed everyone, from freedmen to officials, equal beneath your steady hands. This was ancient Rome peaceful life expressed through routine human connection, a reminder that calm could exist even in a crowded city. Conversation, when it happened, was slow and ordinary, stories exchanged without urgency, silence accepted without discomfort. And when someone left your shop, they carried more than a clean face. They carried the subtle grounding of being tended to without judgment. But Rome's gentler professions extended even further into the private spaces of the city. Perhaps you now find yourself working as a pedagogus, a household tutor, guiding children not with force, but with repetition and patience. Education in daily life in ancient Rome was often quiet, taking place in shaded rooms or garden corners where learning unfolded at a human pace. You read aloud, corrected gently, and allowed mistakes to settle rather than punish them away. Roman jobs like this were valued not for spectacle, but for continuity, shaping minds gradually over years. There was no applause, only the quiet satisfaction of watching understanding take root. In this role, time felt generous rather than scarce, and your work followed the rhythm of growing minds, not political deadlines. And then there were those whose days were shaped by water and movement rather than words, such as the balnéaire, the bath attendant. Public baths were among the most peaceful spaces in ancient Rome, places where noise softened into echo and tension dissolved in warm air. As an attendant, your presence was steady and unobtrusive, guiding visitors, maintaining calm, ensuring comfort. The work was physical but unhurried, repetitive in a way that allowed the mind to drift. Steam rose slowly, conversations faded into murmurs, and your labor supported rest rather than strain. In this ancient Rome peaceful life, you contributed to balance, helping others release the weight of their days. These roles, barber, tutor, bath attendant, were not paths to power, yet they offered something many modern lives lack, a sense of completion without exhaustion. They remind us that daily life in ancient Rome included spaces designed for slowing down, where work served well-being rather than ambition. And as you listen now, let the images overlap gently, the quiet shop, the shaded lesson, the warm bath, each one revealing a Rome that valued steadiness over speed. History often remembers empires by what they conquered, but when viewed through these softer professions, Rome becomes a place where peace was practiced daily, one careful action at a time.
As night approaches in Rome, there were still lives shaped by gentleness rather than urgency. Jobs that unfolded slowly while the city softened into shadow. Imagine now that your work is tied not to crowds or institutions, but to small, trusted exchanges, living the daily life in ancient Rome as a tabellarius, a messenger who carried letters rather than commands. Unlike soldiers who marched under pressure, your movements were measured, your routes familiar. You walked the same paths day after day, learning the rhythm of stones beneath your sandals and the quiet patterns of neighborhoods. Roman jobs like this were built on reliability, not speed, and in that steadiness, the work became calming.
You carried words that mattered to individuals rather than empires. Personal notes, invitations, simple updates, each delivery closing a small circle of connection. In this ancient Rome peaceful life, your value came from trust, from knowing where to go and when to arrive, without haste. As evening deepened, your work naturally slowed, and the city around you exhaled, lamps glowing softly in windows as conversations turned inward. But Rome's quieter labor also lived within the walls of homes, where those skilled with cloth shaped lives through patience. Perhaps you now sit as a Phalanca worker, not in the harsher industrial sense we imagine, but as a textile finisher, handling garments with care. Your task was repetitive and methodical, washing, softening, pressing fabric until it felt right in the hand. The motion was steady, almost meditative, and conversation was sparse, unnecessary. In the repetitive flow, thoughts loosened, and the body found ease. This was daily life in ancient Rome expressed through touch, where quality mattered more than volume. Roman jobs centered on fabric and repair were deeply human, focused on maintaining what already existed rather than chasing novelty. As twilight settled, another gentle profession came alive, the vigil of the watchman, the vigilarius. Unlike soldiers trained for conflict, your duty was observation. You walked calmly through streets, listening more than acting, ensuring fires stayed contained and peace remained undisturbed. The work encouraged awareness without aggression, attentiveness without alarm. In this ancient Rome peaceful life, your presence itself was enough, a reassurance rather than a threat. You knew the city intimately, its sounds, its silences, the way night changed its shape. These roles, messenger, textile worker, watchman, offered something rare, continuity. They allowed a person to end the day with a sense of closure, knowing when work was done. And as you listen now, let the slow movement of these lives guide your breath, the steady walk, the repetitive motion, the quiet watch. History often frames Rome as restless and demanding, but when seen through the lens of daily life in ancient Rome, it reveals jobs that respected limits, honored patience, and allowed peace to arrive naturally with nightfall.
When we step back and let these lives settle together, something unexpected begins to emerge from the daily life in ancient Rome, a truth often hidden beneath stories of conquest and ambition. Rome was not only built by generals and emperors, but by people who chose work that allowed them to remain human. Bakers who greeted the day with warmth rather than fear, mosaicists who shaped beauty one stone at a time, scribes who preserved meaning in silence, gardeners who worked with growth instead of force, and attendants who helped others rest. These were not glamorous Roman jobs, yet they offered stability, predictability, and a sense of completion that many modern lives quietly long for. In this ancient Rome peaceful life, success was not measured by speed or status, but by whether a day ended with the body tired and the mind at ease. Work had clear boundaries, beginning and ending with light, seasons, or routine, allowing rest to follow naturally. There was dignity in repetition, comfort in familiarity, and meaning in serving immediate human needs. As you imagine these roles now, notice how different they feel from the pressure-filled rhythms of today. There are no endless notifications, no invisible expectations following you into the night. When the oven cooled, when the last stone was placed, when the garden was watered, the work was done. This quiet finality is perhaps the greatest luxury these jobs offered. History often celebrates Rome for its power, but through the lens of daily life in ancient Rome, we see something gentler, a civilization that understood the necessity of calm spaces and steady roles. These lives remind us that peace is not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of balance. And as you listen now, let this understanding settle softly. You are not being asked to admire Rome, only to notice that even in one of history's busiest cities, there were paths designed for calm. As this chapter closes, allow your breathing to slow, your thoughts to soften, and your attention to rest. Like those ancient workers, your day too can have an ending. And in that ending, there is room for quiet, for reflection, and for sleep.
For a medieval queen, death was never allowed to arrive as chaos, never permitted to spill into panic or disorder, because even the final breath was expected to obey form, ritual, and control. In the quiet chambers of a stone palace, as life slowly withdrew, the world did not rush in, it slowed, transforming loss into ceremony. This was the beginning of what medieval queens' rituals were meant to achieve: not fear, but dignity; not collapse, but continuity. When the queen's body finally rested, attendants moved with deliberate calm, guided by traditions refined over centuries. Warm water infused with rose petals and fragrant herbs was prepared, lavender and rosemary chosen not only for scent, but for meaning, symbols of purity, memory, and endurance. The washing was gentle, almost reverent, hands steady, movements unhurried, as if acknowledging that the body before them had carried a kingdom within it. In royal funeral history, this moment mattered deeply because it marked the transition from ruler to symbol, from living authority to eternal presence. Silence filled the chamber, broken only by murmured prayers and the soft rustle of linen. Nothing was improvised. Every action followed medieval death etiquette, ensuring that grief remained contained, shaped into something bearable. In this ordered stillness, the queen's passing became an act of restraint, a lesson in composure. But one ritual stood apart, strange and poetic even by medieval standards: the partition of the heart. It was believed that a queen's heart held more devotion than one place could contain: devotion to her people, her faith, her homeland. And so, after careful preparation, the heart would be separated, preserved, and carried to a location of deepest meaning, perhaps a quiet abbey she favored, or the land of her birth. This act was not macabre, but symbolic, a final expression of divided love and enduring loyalty. In the language of medieval queens' rituals, the body might belong to the crown, but the heart belonged to memory. As candles of beeswax flickered, casting warm, steady light, the atmosphere remained solemn rather than dramatic. There were no wails echoing through halls, no uncontrolled sorrow. Instead, chants rose and fell in slow rhythm, measured like a heartbeat, guiding those present into acceptance. Royal funeral history tells us that these ceremonies could last days, sometimes weeks, unfolding with patience rather than urgency. Time itself seemed to bow, allowing grief to be processed gradually, safely. This was medieval death etiquette at its most refined, transforming the inevitability of death into a structured farewell. For those who witnessed it, the ritual offered something rare, a sense that even in loss, order could be preserved. As you listen now, let this vision settle softly, a queen surrounded not by fear, but by calm precision, her final moments framed as a testament to control. In a world that often faced sudden violence and uncertainty, these rituals were acts of defiance against chaos, reminders that dignity could outlast breath. And as this chapter opens, we begin to see how medieval queens did not simply die, they concluded their lives as carefully as they had lived them, turning death into a final, composed statement of permanence. After the first rituals had been completed, the chamber of mourning did not dissolve into grief, it transformed into a space of measured stillness, where every movement was intentional and every pause held meaning. In the world of medieval queens' rituals, waiting was as important as action. Time itself became part of the ceremony. The queen's body was not rushed toward burial because haste suggested disorder, and disorder had no place in royal funeral history. Instead, days unfolded slowly, allowing the court to adjust, to absorb loss without letting it fracture stability. Embalmers worked quietly, using spices and resins not to defy death, but to honor form, preserving the body long enough for farewell to be conducted with dignity. This careful preservation reflected medieval death etiquette at its core. Death was not an interruption, but a transition requiring discipline. Meanwhile, the court continued its routines in hushed tones. Servants walked softer, voices lowered, gestures restrained. The queen's presence lingered, not as absence, but as structure. Drapes of deep black or royal purple covered walls and windows, muting light and sound, creating an environment where emotions were held rather than released. This visual restraint was not meant to suppress feeling, but to contain it, transforming raw sorrow into controlled remembrance. In this atmosphere, mourning became collective and ceremonial rather than personal and overwhelming. One of the most striking elements of medieval queens' rituals was the procession, when the queen's body was finally moved. Streets were cleared not for spectacle but for order. Bells rang slowly, deliberately, not to shock but to mark rhythm. People did not shout or cry openly. They stood still, heads bowed, absorbing the gravity of the moment. In royal funeral history, this procession was a lesson in composure, teaching an entire city how to face loss without chaos. Even the pace of walking mattered. Steps were measured, pauses deliberate, reinforcing the idea that control was the final gift of the crown. Clergy led chants that rose and fell steadily, guiding breath and thought, creating a shared emotional cadence. Medieval death etiquette dictated that grief must be expressed through form, not excess, because form preserved continuity. As night approached, candlelight replaced daylight, and the procession seemed to float rather than move, shadows stretching softly along stone walls. The queen's identity shifted again, no longer ruler, not yet memory, but symbol. In these hours, the ritual protected both the living and the dead. It offered the court a script to follow, preventing panic, and it granted the queen a final role, embodying permanence. As you listen now, notice how these rituals echo a stoic understanding of loss, that what cannot be controlled must be met with structure, that dignity lies not in resisting death, but in shaping how it is faced. The medieval world understood this intuitively. In a time of frequent illness and uncertainty, these ceremonies were not indulgent, they were necessary, acts of psychological survival. Through medieval queens' rituals and royal funeral history, death became a shared discipline, a collective exercise in calm. And as this part of the chapter draws to a close, let the image remain with you, a slow procession, steady light,
measured silence, reminding us that even at the edge of life, order could still prevail.
Beyond the procession and the measured waiting, there was another layer to medieval queens' rituals that unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, shaping how a queen would be remembered long after the candles burned out. Memory itself was carefully managed. In royal funeral history, nothing was left to chance, not even how grief would age over time. Chroniclers, clergy, and courtiers were instructed through subtle signals to emphasize composure, virtue, and continuity. The queen was spoken of not in terms of suffering, but of endurance, not of loss, but of legacy. This was medieval death etiquette refined into narrative control. Words chosen in sermons were deliberate, steady, designed to calm rather than inflame. They guided listeners away from despair and toward acceptance, reinforcing the idea that the queen's death was part of a larger, ordered design. In this way, mourning became a disciplined story told to an entire kingdom. Symbols played a quiet but powerful role. Heraldic colors, emblems, and banners appeared in restrained forms, reminding observers of stability rather than change. Even clothing worn by mourners followed strict codes, textures muted, silhouettes simple, encouraging inward reflection rather than outward display. This visual restraint was a form of emotional governance, ensuring that grief did not fracture into unrest. Medieval queens' rituals understood that crowds mirror emotion, and that calm, once established, could spread as effectively as panic. Inside monasteries and abbeys, prayers continued long after burial, not loudly, but persistently. These ongoing devotions extended the ritual across time, allowing mourning to be absorbed slowly into daily life. Royal funeral history shows that remembrance was not meant to overwhelm, but to integrate, to become part of routine rather than rupture. This approach aligned closely with a stoic sensibility, acknowledging that death is unavoidable, but chaos is optional. By providing structure, the ritual protected the living from being consumed by loss. As you listen now, notice how this careful shaping of memory feels gentle rather than manipulative. In an age without modern psychology, these practices served the same purpose, containing grief within forms that allowed communities to function. The queen's image softened over time, becoming serene, almost distant, a figure of quiet authority rather than pain. Medieval death etiquette ensured that her story concluded not with anguish, but with composure, and in that composure, the kingdom found permission to continue. Let this idea rest with you, that remembrance, when guided with care, can soothe rather than disturb. This part of the chapter reveals that the true art of control was not in denying death, but in teaching people how to remember it without fear. As the rituals extended beyond burial, the queen's death continued to shape the living through absence carefully organized into presence. In medieval queens' rituals, what followed mattered just as much as what came before. Tombs were not conceived as places of finality, but as ongoing symbols of order. Stone effigies carved in calm repose depicted the queen not as lifeless, but as resting, hands folded, face serene, untouched by struggle. This visual language was intentional. In royal funeral history, the image of peaceful stillness served as reassurance, teaching observers that even death could be composed. Visitors approached these tombs quietly, guided by spatial design that slowed movement and encouraged reflection. Chapels were arranged to soften sound, to diffuse light, creating an atmosphere where contemplation replaced fear. Medieval death etiquette extended into architecture itself,
shaping how bodies moved, how voices lowered, how thoughts settled. Annual commemorations reinforced this rhythm. On designated days, prayers were repeated, candles lit, names spoken with restraint rather than emotion. These rituals did not reopen wounds, they sealed them gently, integrating loss into the calendar of life. In this way, mourning became predictable, manageable, a known shape rather than an unpredictable surge. The Queen's absence no longer threatened stability because it had been absorbed into routine. This was the deeper function of medieval Queen's rituals, transforming fear of death into familiarity. For a society surrounded by uncertainty, this familiarity was protective. It allowed people to coexist with mortality without being overwhelmed. As you listen now, notice how this approach aligns with Stoic acceptance, acknowledging impermanence while refusing to surrender to it emotionally. The rituals did not promise immortality, they promised continuity, and continuity was enough. Through royal funeral history, we see that power was not only exercised in life, but maintained through carefully shaped remembrance. The Queen, in death, became a stabilizing force rather than a source of anxiety. Let this image rest with you. Stone figures bathed in soft light, candles flickering steadily, time moving forward without rupture. This part of the chapter reveals that mastery over death was never about control of fate, but about control of response, a lesson as relevant now as it was centuries ago.
When all the rituals had been completed and the candles finally burned low, what remained was not fear, but a carefully cultivated calm, the true legacy of medieval Queen's rituals. These ceremonies were never meant to deny death. They were designed to master the human response to it. In royal funeral history, the Queen's passing became a lesson offered quietly to an entire society, showing that loss, when shaped by form, could strengthen rather than fracture. Medieval death etiquette transformed grief into a shared discipline, guiding emotion into channels that preserved stability. Through washing, waiting, procession, memory, and monument, death was rendered intelligible, almost familiar. This familiarity did not trivialize loss, it softened it, allowing people to continue living without being consumed. At its core, this was an expression of Stoic wisdom long before Stoicism became a modern label. Control what can be controlled and meet the inevitable with dignity. The Queen's final journey demonstrated that power does not vanish at death, it changes shape. Authority became atmosphere, order embedded in ritual, calm sustained by repetition. As you listen now, notice how this perspective reframes mortality, not as an enemy, but as a boundary that invites composure. In a world where uncertainty was constant, these rituals offered something priceless: predictability. They told the living exactly what to do, how to feel, and when to rest. And in doing so, they reduced fear. This is why medieval Queen's rituals continue to fascinate us today. They reveal a culture that understood something we often forget: that serenity is built, not found. Royal funeral history shows that the most enduring form of control is not force, but structure, not denial, but acceptance shaped into practice. As this chapter closes, allow that idea to settle gently. Like the slow extinguishing of candlelight, let your thoughts dim without urgency. The Queen's story does not end in darkness, but in stillness. And in that stillness, there is room for breath, for quiet,
and for sleep. Before written law, before formal institutions, and long before science could explain the world with certainty, ancient cultures relied on something quieter but just as powerful: taboo. These ancient taboos were not created to frighten people, but to steady them, forming an invisible safety net stretched across a world filled with uncertainty. In the dim spaces of early human history, where illness appeared without warning and death arrived without explanation, taboos offered structure. They told people where to step carefully, where to pause, and where not to look too closely. This is why so many weird history facts tied to ancient superstitions feel strangely gentle when viewed closely. Consider the custom of covering mirrors when someone died, a practice that appears across cultures separated by vast distances. To ancient minds, mirrors and still water were not just surfaces, they were thresholds. Reflections were thought to blur the boundary between worlds, and in moments of grief, that boundary felt dangerously thin. Covering a mirror was not an act of fear, but of protection, a soft gesture meant to guide the soul safely onward and to shield the living from lingering uncertainty. In daily life, such acts reassured families that they were doing something right in the face of loss. These ancient taboos transformed helplessness into action, giving people a role to play when answers were unavailable. Another familiar ritual, the quiet phrase, "bless you," after a sneeze, carries a similar origin. In ancient superstitions, breath was life itself, the visible sign of spirit moving within the body. A sudden sneeze felt like a moment of vulnerability, as if the soul might be briefly unsettled. The spoken blessing functioned like a small verbal charm, a protective pause that restored balance. In this way, words became tools of comfort. Far from irrational, these customs reveal an emotional intelligence embedded in ancient cultures. They acknowledged fear without amplifying it, offering reassurance through repetition. Ancient taboos worked because they were predictable. When the world felt chaotic, ritual restored order, even if only symbolically. This predictability calmed minds and reduced anxiety, allowing communities to function despite constant uncertainty. When we examine weird history facts through this lens, they stop appearing strange and begin to feel deeply human. Taboos were never about control for its own sake, they were about care. They provided boundaries that made daily life feel safer. In ancient cultures, superstition was not opposed to reason. It filled the gaps where reason had not yet reached. As you listen now, let this understanding settle. Imagine a world without explanations, where invisible forces seemed close at all times. In that world, taboo was a form of kindness, a shared agreement that said, "You were not alone in your fear." These ancient superstitions did not promise certainty, but they offered calm. And calm in a fragile world was everything. Across ancient cultures, taboos quietly shaped daily behavior, not by threat, but by reassurance, guiding people through moments when the unknown felt close and personal. Many ancient taboos focused on liminal moments, times when one state shifted into another: dawn and dusk, birth and death, sickness and recovery. These transitions felt fragile, and ancient superstitions stepped in to provide balance. Consider the widespread belief that one should not sweep a house at night. To modern ears, it sounds like one of those weird history facts meant to amuse. Yet to ancient families, night was a boundary where safety thinned. Darkness limited vision, amplified imagination, and invited uncertainty. Sweeping at night symbolized the risk of accidentally sweeping away good fortune or protective spirits. By postponing the task until daylight, people restored a sense of control, aligning action with visibility and calm. this was not fear, but timing, a recognition that some moments were better left untouched. Another common taboo warned against naming the dead too freely. In many ancient cultures, names were believed to carry presence. Speaking a name could summon memory too strongly, disturbing both the living and the departed. Silence, in this context, was not erasure, but respect. It allowed grief to breathe without being overwhelmed. These ancient superstitions offered emotional regulation long before psychology existed as a discipline. They provided scripts for behavior when emotions threatened to spill over. When illness struck, taboos multiplied. Avoid certain foods, avoid certain paths, avoid certain words. Each avoidance narrowed the field of anxiety, turning diffuse fear into specific action. By following rules, people felt held within a framework. Ancient taboos transformed uncertainty into something manageable, something that could be navigated rather than endured. Even communal spaces were shaped by these beliefs. Sacred groves, crossroads, and thresholds carried restrictions not to exclude, but to signal caution. A pause before crossing was a moment to collect oneself. In this way, taboo slowed life down. It inserted breath into movement. When we examine weird history facts through this lens, they reveal a deep understanding of human vulnerability. Ancient cultures recognized that the mind seeks patterns under stress. Taboos provided those patterns. They told people, here is what to do when you do not know what to do. As you listen now, let this idea settle gently. Imagine living without explanations, without guarantees, surrounded by forces you cannot see. In that world, taboo was not superstition, it was support. It allowed communities to coexist with uncertainty without being consumed by it. Ancient superstitions, far from being relics of ignorance, were tools of emotional survival. And in their quiet persistence, they continue to whisper a simple truth: calm is cultivated through structure.
Many ancient taboos did not seek to explain the unknown. They sought to soften its impact on the human mind. In a world where storms arrived without warning and illness moved invisibly through communities, ancient superstitions offered a way to narrow attention, to reduce the overwhelming into the manageable. Consider the widespread taboo against pointing at rainbows or celestial signs. To ancient observers, the sky was not empty space, but a living surface where meaning appeared unexpectedly. Drawing attention to such signs felt risky, as if naming them too directly might invite disruption. By lowering the gaze and remaining quiet, people preserved a sense of safety. This behavior was not rooted in fear of punishment, but in the desire to maintain equilibrium. Ancient taboos often functioned as instructions for humility, reminding individuals that not everything required interpretation or response. Another subtle taboo involved thresholds, doorways, bridges, and borders. These places marked transition, neither fully one state nor another, and ancient cultures treated them with caution. Pausing before crossing, avoiding certain words, or performing small gestures created a moment of grounding. In terms of weird history facts, these customs seem excessive, yet psychologically they inserted control into moments that might otherwise trigger anxiety. By ritualizing transitions, ancient superstitions reduced uncertainty. The mind could relax, knowing there was a prescribed way to move forward. Even everyday activities like eating carried taboos. Certain foods were avoided during times of mourning or illness, not because they were dangerous, but because restriction itself created clarity. Limiting choice reduces cognitive strain, a truth modern psychology confirms. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. When life felt fragile, fewer options meant fewer worries. Ancient taboos acted as mental shortcuts, conserving emotional energy. They told people when to stop, when to wait, and when to proceed slowly. As you listen now, notice how these patterns echo familiar comforts today. Routines before sleep, quiet rituals that signal safety. Though framed differently, they serve the same purpose. Ancient superstitions were not about enforcing belief, they were about preserving calm. They offered predictability where nature offered none. In this way, taboo became a shared agreement to protect one another from excess fear. Ancient cultures recognized that the mind needs boundaries to rest. By accepting limits, people gained peace. And in that peace, they found the strength to endure uncertainty without being overwhelmed.
As ancient societies grew larger and more complex, taboos quietly evolved into shared emotional agreements, helping entire communities regulate fear and uncertainty together. These ancient taboos were not enforced by punishment alone, but by mutual understanding, a collective sense that some boundaries protected everyone. In moments of crisis, famine, plague, or sudden death, ancient superstitions multiplied, not to confuse, but to concentrate attention. Rules about where to walk, what to touch, and when to speak created islands of certainty within chaos. One striking pattern across weird history facts is how taboos often appeared strongest around communal harmony. Speaking loudly near burial grounds, laughing during mourning periods, or violating silence in sacred spaces was discouraged, not because joy was forbidden, but because emotional contrast could destabilize those already vulnerable. By aligning behavior, ancient cultures reduced emotional friction. Everyone knew the tone to adopt, the pace to follow, the gestures to avoid. This synchronization soothed collective nerves. In this sense, taboo functioned like a social lullaby, gently guiding behavior toward calm. Even celebrations carried restrictions. Certain days demanded restraint rather than indulgence, teaching balance rather than excess. Ancient superstitions understood that emotional extremes exhausted communities. By moderating joy as carefully as sorrow, taboos preserved long-term stability. This balance resonates deeply with Stoic thought, which values moderation as a path to inner peace. As you listen now, imagine a village moving quietly through a shared ritual, each person aware of invisible lines that kept emotions from spilling over. These lines were not cages, but supports. They held people upright when the ground felt unstable. Ancient taboos offered predictability, allowing individuals to trust that others would act in ways that felt safe. This trust reduced vigilance, allowing rest. In a world without modern institutions, this shared discipline was essential. Ancient superstitions created emotional infrastructure, unseen but reliable. They taught when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. By distributing responsibility across the group, taboos prevented individuals from bearing the full weight of uncertainty alone. Fear became communal and therefore lighter. As this part of the chapter unfolds, notice how these practices reframed anxiety not as a personal failing, but as a shared human experience. Through taboo, ancient cultures acknowledged vulnerability without amplifying it. They did not promise control over fate, but they offered control over response. And that distinction made all the difference.
In the quiet rhythm of these shared limits, people found room to breathe, to sleep, and to endure another day.
When we step back and look at ancient taboos as a whole, a quiet truth emerges from beneath the strange details and weird history facts. These customs were never meant to imprison the mind, they were meant to calm it. In ancient cultures where uncertainty was constant and explanations were scarce, taboos acted as an invisible architecture of reassurance. They told people that even when the world felt unpredictable, their responses did not have to be. Ancient superstitions softened fear by giving it shape, boundaries, and rhythm. Instead of endless anxiety, there was a shared understanding of what to do, what to avoid, and when to rest. This transformed chaos into something livable. What modern eyes often dismiss as irrational behavior was, in truth, a sophisticated emotional system. Ancient taboos acknowledged human vulnerability without judgment. They accepted that fear was natural, then gently guided it into routines that preserved balance. In this sense, taboo functioned much like stoic practice. It did not promise control over fate, but offered mastery over reaction. By agreeing to limits, people gained peace. By following shared rules, communities gained trust. Over time, these ancient superstitions wove themselves so deeply into daily life that they became almost invisible, quietly doing their work in the background. They allowed people to sleep at night, knowing that unseen dangers had been acknowledged and addressed, at least symbolically. As you listen now, let this understanding settle into calm recognition. The past was not ruled by fear, but by care shaped into ritual. Ancient cultures built safety nets out of belief because belief was all they had. And those nets held. They reduced loneliness, eased grief, and softened the edges of the unknown. As this chapter closes, notice how familiar this feels. Even today, we rely on routines, small habits, and quiet rules to feel safe. The forms have changed, but the need remains the same. Ancient taboos remind us that calm is not accidental, it is constructed. And when constructed gently, it becomes a place where the mind can finally rest.
She was called the Queen of the Desert, and in the golden stillness of Palmyra, Zenobia ruled not with noise, but with presence. This ancient city, rising from the sands with rows of sunlit columns and the quiet rhythm of caravans, was the heart of the Palmyrene Empire, a place balanced between worlds, Roman, Persian, Greek, and Arab. From here, Queen Zenobia governed with a calm authority that made even Rome uneasy. Unlike the image often associated with ancient warrior queens, she did not rule through spectacle alone. She rode alongside her generals beneath the open sky, shared wine with her soldiers at dusk, and spoke Greek with the fluency of a philosopher who understood both words and meaning. In the daily life of the Palmyrene Empire, her presence was steady, deliberate, almost stoic in its restraint. Zenobia understood that power, to last, must feel composed. She dressed simply when others expected excess, listened longer than she spoke, and allowed silence to do part of her ruling. As Roman pressure grew and borders tightened, her resolve did not harden into panic. Instead, it clarified. She expanded her influence not as a conqueror intoxicated by ambition, but as a guardian of balance, protecting Palmyra's independence in a world dominated by empires. In Roman records, Queen Zenobia appears as both a threat and an anomaly, a woman who refused to collapse under expectation. Her leadership challenged assumptions about gender, power, and obedience, placing her among the most enduring ancient warrior queens, not because of brutality, but because of composure. As you listen now, imagine Palmyra at twilight, stone glowing softly, the desert breathing in slow waves of heat, and Zenobia watching it all without hurry. Her strength did not shout, it endured. This part of her life reminds us that resilience often appears quiet, almost invisible until tested, and it was about to be tested by Rome itself.
When Rome finally turned its full attention toward the desert, the name of Emperor Aurelian carried with it the weight of inevitability. His legions moved with discipline sharpened by years of conquest, and against such force, even the Palmyrene Empire felt the tightening of fate. Yet Queen Zenobia did not meet this moment with despair. In the quiet councils of Palmyra, her response was measured, almost serene. She knew that resistance was not always about victory. Sometimes it was about refusing to yield one's dignity. As the Roman advance grew closer, Zenobia rode once more with her generals, not to inflame courage, but to steady it. Her presence reminded them that fear was a reaction, not a command. In accounts of ancient warrior queens, this is where legends often turn loud, filled with reckless charges and dramatic speeches. Zenobia chose another path. She spoke little, acted deliberately, and prepared her people for endurance rather than triumph. Battles were fought across harsh terrain, where desert winds erased footprints as quickly as they were made. With each engagement, the imbalance of power became clearer, yet Zenobia's composure did not fracture. She understood a deeply stoic truth, that while outcomes are uncertain, character remains within one's control. As Roman pressure mounted, retreat became inevitable. Palmyra's defenses thinned, supply lines weakened, and the empire she had guarded began to recede like a mirage. Still, Zenobia did not flee in panic. When capture came, it arrived quietly, almost anticlimactically, a moment stripped of drama. In Roman narratives, Queen Zenobia is often framed as defeated, but this framing misses what mattered most. Defeat did not unmake her. In that still moment, surrounded by soldiers who expected submission, she maintained posture, gaze steady, voice calm. The Palmyrean Empire had fallen, but the queen had not. As you listen now, let this image rest with you. A woman standing at the edge of history, facing the unstoppable force of Rome without bitterness. Her resistance was not only military, it was internal. And that internal resistance would soon become the most enduring part of her story.
Of all the moments in Queen Zenobia's life, none has endured in memory quite like her passage through Rome itself. Not as a conqueror, but as a captive, led through streets built to celebrate domination. Roman triumphs were designed to erase the dignity of the defeated, to reduce them to symbols of submission. Yet in royal accounts and later whispers of the Palmyrene Empire, Zenobia's presence resisted that design. Tradition tells us she was bound in chains of gold, heavy enough to slow her steps, yet chosen deliberately, for Rome wished to display wealth as much as victory. But gold, in this moment, became something else. It failed to humiliate. Each measured step she took transformed the spectacle. Her posture remained upright, her gaze forward, her expression unreadable. She did not plead, she did not perform despair. Among ancient warrior queens, this quiet refusal to collapse is what sets Zenobia apart.
Rome expected a lesson in dominance. Instead, it received a lesson in composure. The crowd watched not a broken ruler, but a figure whose dignity outlasted her power. In the language of stoic endurance, Zenobia had lost what was never truly hers to keep: territory, armies, titles. What remained was character, and that could not be taken. As you listen now, imagine the sound of footsteps against stone, the low murmur of the city, the weight of gold pressing down not on her spirit, but on the expectations of those watching. The Palmyrene Empire was gone, yet Zenobia's presence made absence visible. Rome could conquer lands, but it could not command inner surrender. This moment reveals why her story endures beyond conquest. Defeat, when met with composure, becomes a form of resistance. And in that resistance, Zenobia achieved something rare. She forced history to pause and look again. After the triumph had ended, and the city of Rome returned to its noise, Zenobia did not vanish into darkness. History records something quieter and far more revealing. Instead of execution, the fate Rome often reserved for defiant rulers, Queen Zenobia was granted life. She was taken away from the spectacle and placed into stillness. In the hills of Tivoli, far from the desert heat of Palmyra and the marble weight of Rome, she lived her final years in a villa surrounded by gardens and flowing water. For many ancient warrior queens, survival after defeat was rare. Yet Zenobia's story continued, not in chains, but in reflection. This ending reveals the deepest stoic dimension of her life. Stripped of empire, army, and command, she faced the ultimate question: who are you when power is gone? Zenobia answered not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Roman writers note that she lived with dignity, studied philosophy, and raised her children in quiet order. The Palmyrene Empire existed now only in memory, but Zenobia remained fully herself. She had lost what was external, but preserved what was essential. In Stoic thought, this distinction defines freedom. As you listen now, imagine her walking slowly through shaded paths, the sound of water replacing the roar of crowds, her thoughts unburdened by strategy or command. This was not a punishment, it was a release. Rome believed it had neutralized a threat. In truth, it had revealed a woman who no longer needed to resist. Her strength had completed its work. Among Queen Zenobia's many legacies, this quiet survival is often overlooked, yet it may be the most powerful. She showed that dignity does not depend on victory, and peace does not require dominance. In letting go, she demonstrated mastery, and mastery, when reached, requires no audience. As the embers fade and the night deepens, the stories we have walked through begin to loosen their hold. The bakers of ancient Rome have long since finished their work, their ovens cooled, their mornings dissolved into history. The chants for medieval queens have fallen silent, candles burned down to pools of wax, grief shaped into calm remembrance. The ancient taboos that once guarded fragile minds have softened into habits we barely notice, quiet echoes of humanity learning how to feel safe. And now, the desert of Palmyra rests beneath the stars, its columns broken but dignified, wind passing gently through what remains. Queen Zenobia, once the heart of the Palmyrene Empire, no longer rides or resists. She exists instead as a memory of composure, a reminder that strength does not always shout and dignity does not disappear when power is gone. In the long view of history, empires rise and fall, rituals fade, and even Rome becomes a whisper. What endures is not conquest, but character. These stories were never meant to impress you with scale or drama. They were meant to slow your breathing, to remind you that humans before us faced uncertainty with courage shaped into routine, fear softened by structure, and loss met with quiet resolve. As you rest now, allow the weight of the past to lift from your shoulders. You are not required to carry these lives forward. They have already done their work. Let the images blur gently, columns into sand, fire into ash, voices into silence. The present moment remains, calm and sufficient. There is nothing left to understand, nothing left to prepare for, only rest. Sleep gently and let history drift away.